And that ties into something called the Pareto Principle. Now, the Pareto Principle was based on an Italian economist. I think his name was Vilfredo Pareto. And he worked in Rome. He helped sort of determine where to collect the tax revenue. But he was also a gardener. And so he noticed that when he was growing his pea plants in his backyard, that about 20% of his pea plants produced about 80% of his peas. So he wanted to figure out a way to figure out which of those 20% of his pea plants, what qualities they had, so he could make sure that he grows those exclusively to try and increase the number of peas that he was getting each year. So he was focused completely on that 20%. So what could he do to determine what that 20% was? Those were his most valuable pea plants. And so he wanted to sort of make sure they had the best soil or sun or whatever. And so he was working on this, and he also came back to work, and he was trying to figure out if this 80-20 rule was applicable to other areas. And so he looked at how taxes were being collected in Rome, and he noticed about 20% of Rome's citizens were producing about 80% of their taxes. And he was like, this is kind of strange. This 80-20 rule keeps on showing up. And so a lot of times with Agile teams, or even in traditional project management, you can think about the Pareto rule as being 20% of your causes produce about 80% of your effect. And so with Agile, and even with other areas, you want to focus on that 20%. And you'll see this kind of in other areas like customer service, where they say that 20% of your customers will give you 80% of your problems, or 20% of your products will give you 80% of your revenue. So that's one way to sort of focus on value. And so if you think about it, that kind of makes sense with software products. If you've ever used a software product like Microsoft Word, you might notice that you don't use 100% of its functions and features. Instead, you probably focus on maybe 20%. Maybe you use print or spell check or even the grammar, but you don't necessarily install all the different language packs, or you don't necessarily do mail merges and things like that every day. And so with software, it's very important to kind of focus on this 20%. And this is one of the key ideas behind Agile, is that you want to figure out what this highest value part of the software is, or what your customer sees as the highest value part of your software, and focus on that first, and sort of think about it at the beginning. So around 1998 or something like that, there was a group called the Standish Group, and they came out with this chart of how different functions and features were used in different software products. And so they looked at a bunch of different software products, and then they looked at how a bunch of different customers were using their software products, and they tried to figure out how many of the functions and features in these different software products the customers actually used. And what they found is that in these software products, and at the time, these software products may have cost millions of dollars. 40% of the functions and features in these software products were never used by the customer. They didn't even know they existed. And then you might find this to be true with Microsoft Word. It might do huge numbers of things that you have no idea that it does. And so, that's 40%. For you, that might be the 45% that you never use. And then about 19% you rarely use. You kind of knew it was there, but you didn't really ever use it, or maybe once or twice, or heard it existed or something like that. And then about 16% these different customers would sometimes use. That means that they knew it was there and then occasionally used it, but they had to break out the manual or something like that. And then there was about 13% that they often used. Maybe they used it once a week or something like that. And then there was 7% that they always used. And so these are the different functions and features of these software applications and how each customer used them, what percentage of the time they used them. And so if you look very closely, you can see that this pie chart follows the Pareto Principle. So 7% is always used and 13% is often used. So 20% of that software product is the most valuable to the customer. And the other 80% is only sometimes used or rarely used or never used. So if you think about it, the way that this ties into Agile software, the way that it ties into Agile software delivery is that when you're working on a team, that is embracing a more agile mindset, you want to encourage your customer to start at the very top, at the 7%. And then the team should work its way down through the other parts of the functions and features that customers rarely or never use. And so in Scrum, you'll see this often in the product backlog, as there'll be like a ranked list of all the things that your customer wants delivered. And they have to start at the highest value items, the things that their customer will always use or often use, and then work their way through until they get to things that they might sometimes use. Now, if you're working in an Agile team, you try not to ever get into functions and features that your customer will never use, because that's not very valuable. But you want to start at the very top. What are the things, and this is the difficult part for your customer to figure out. What are the things, the functions and features that their customer will always or often use? And then start at that, and then work your way down to the other functions and features. And in Scrum, you'll see this again as the role as the product owner. They'll figure out the highest value items, product backlog items, sometimes these are user stories, and then they'll work their way through and try to deliver those first. And so instead of a typical traditional project where you're working on all the function features that you're going to have in the entire product at once, and an Agile team that is embracing a more Agile mindset should work on the highest value things first and then work their way down. So if it's true that if your team is able to develop that 7% and finish it, then only then should they move on to the 13%. And if they're able to finish that 20%, which teams rarely, if never do, then they should work in that 16%. And so they should focus entirely on the most valuable functions and features and deliver them first. So if you think about this in the context of something like Microsoft Word, if you were going to use an Agile mindset to develop a product like Microsoft Word, you try to find the functions and features, that 7% that people always use. Maybe it's the fact that it opens up and then you can type in it. And maybe everybody uses spell check, so that's part of the 7%. And everybody uses it to save, so that's part of that 7%. And everybody uses it to print, and that's part of that 7%. But not everybody needs it to speak, not everybody needs to use mail merge. Maybe that's only part of the 13%. And so if you were going to use an Agile approach, have an Agile mindset to deliver a product like Microsoft Word, something that was going to compete with it, it would just be a simple editor that would come up and basically just print and do spell check and save. But the key part with it being an Agile product is that it would entirely work. Is it wouldn't be sort of a wireframe, or it wouldn't be a PowerPoint presentation. If you were going to come up with something that was a Microsoft Word competitor, it would just be something like simple editor, and it would just come up, you could type in a few words, it would do a spell check, and you could print and save, because that's what people, the 7% always uses. And then over time, you would build up the product to features that people often use. And over time, maybe sometimes use. And then you would end up, over time, developing a much more robust product, iteratively. You'd be building it up over time. So let's think about a question here that you might have so far, just to get a sense of how you should think about these things. So after your project is complete, which sentence would a product owner most like to hear? Is it A, the product was completed on time and under budget? B, maximum value was delivered to the customer? C, the original specification was delivered? Or D, there was no bugs in the final product? So think about which sentence would a product owner, and the product owner is the customer representative, so this is your customer, which would they most like to hear? So think about this. It's B. The maximum value was delivered to the customer. Because remember, think of that pie chart. That's like a pie chart of what's valuable. Those are the functions and features that your customer will always use. And so that value needs to be delivered first. That's the maximum value. And that's part of the Agile mindset. Are you delivering that product sort of one slice at a time? Starting with the most valuable and then working your way across.